In the early 1800s, the American frontier was a patchwork of rugged ambition and untamed wilderness. Illinois, not yet a state, was still part of the Northwest Territory, an expanse of forests, prairies, and rivers that beckoned pioneers with the promise of land and opportunity. Settlers, many fleeing crowded eastern cities or seeking a fresh start after war and hardship, pushed westward with little more than wagons, tools, and sheer determination. It was within this raw and often lawless landscape that the need for organized childcare quietly emerged. Among the swelling migrant population were orphaned or abandoned children, some left behind by cholera, others by conflict, and many simply lost in the shuffle of survival. Communities tried to care for them when they could, but frontier life left little room for charity. Work was endless. Crops needed tending. Winters were brutal. Mothers died in childbirth, fathers fell to accidents, and children, if they were lucky, were taken in by neighbors or distant kin. But by 1812, in one remote settlement just east of the Mississippi River, a different solution had formed, a dedicated childcare home, cobbled together from logs and hope. It was not called an orphanage then. The term hadn't yet solidified in common use. Locals referred to it simply as the Children's House, or Miss Clara's, named after Clara Bembridge, a widow from Kentucky who had traveled north with her brother's family. Clara, known for her stern demeanor and deep religious conviction, began taking in children sometime around 1810. What started as a gesture of neighborly aid quickly turned into something far larger. By the spring of 1812, more than 50 children, some as young as 2, most under 12, were living under her care. The childcare home was built near a wooded ridge close to a stream, a spot chosen for its access to fresh water and distance from the growing settlement's noisier elements. The structure itself was modest, 2 main rooms with lofts, a separate cooking lean-to, and a nearby shed for supplies. The children slept on straw mattresses, often 5 or 6 to a bed. There was no insulation, no glass windows, only shutters, open hearths, and the thinnest protection from the elements. The community viewed Clara's work with a mixture of admiration and detachment. She was filling a need few others wanted to face. Taking in orphans was noble, certainly, but it was also messy. The children were unclean, loud, traumatized. Clara herself was strict, keeping them on rigid schedules of prayer, chores, and simple lessons, reading scripture, tending a garden, washing laundry in the creek. She rarely smiled. Yet few could deny that her home offered something the rest of the frontier did not: structure. Still, her efforts were underfunded and mostly unsupported. The territorial government had no system for child welfare. Donations were sparse. Sometimes families would leave a sack of flour, or neighbors would share firewood, but for the most part, Clara relied on what she could grow and what the children could help forage. Older children cared for the younger. Illnesses spread quickly in the cramped quarters, and while Clara had some knowledge of herbs and poultices, there were no doctors nearby. When a child became ill, survival was often a matter of chance. By the time spring of 1812 arrived, the childcare home was already stretched thin. Harsh winter storms had battered the roof and ruined much of the preserved food. A measles outbreak earlier in the year had weakened several children, and rats had gotten into the grain stores. Clara wrote in a now-lost letter, mentioned years later in a settler's diary, that she feared the children would not all survive the summer. These were not the words of melodrama, but of grim realism. There were murmurs even then, among neighbors, about the home's limits. About whether too many children had been placed under one roof. About Clara's ability to keep up. But in a territory where everyone was busy surviving, questions rarely turned into interventions. Children were often seen as hardy, almost feral beings of the land, expected to endure, to adapt. And if they didn't? Well, few were counted. Fewer still were remembered. The foundation of this childcare home, though humble in its intention, reflected a deeper truth about early American expansion: for all its ideals, it often left the most vulnerable behind. The children of the Illinois frontier were born into a world that was not ready for them, not structurally, not politically, not morally. And so, a house was built. Logs were nailed. Beds were shared. And life, such as it was, carried on behind those rough-hewn walls. Life inside the childcare home was marked by a constant tension between necessity and neglect. Though the intent behind its creation was rooted in care, the execution was shaped by scarcity. The building itself, barely more than a cabin, had no true insulation, and the walls leaked cold air in winter and stifled heat in summer. Inside, over 50 children lived shoulder to shoulder, the sound of coughing, crying, and restless sleep filling every night. They fed them, clothed them, cleaned their waste, and tried their best to calm them during fevers and nightmares. These older children weren't trained or even particularly prepared, they simply did what they had to. Play was a rare luxury. Most days were filled with work, hauling buckets from the creek, scrubbing laundry against worn stones, collecting kindling from the woods, and planting beans or turnips in the small garden plot. The home operated without formal schedules, but daily rhythms became ritualized out of survival. Mornings began at dawn with a prayer, followed by a thin breakfast, usually boiled oats or bread if available. Afterward, chores filled the hours until midday, when a second, often meager, meal was served. Clara expected silence during meals and prayers. Talking out of turn resulted in punishment, standing outside in the cold, being denied. These disciplinary methods, harsh by modern standards, were accepted by most frontier communities as necessary to maintain order among such a large group of children. The physical space itself amplified the strain. There were not enough beds, not enough blankets. During the winter, children huddled together for warmth, stacking bodies like firewood under a shared quilt. During summer, the heat grew unbearable. Mosquitoes swarmed through the shutters, biting exposed skin through the night. Flies congregated around the cooking lean-to, where spoiled meat and stale bread often served as the only available food. Spoiled water from the creek was sometimes all there was to drink, especially when the rainclouds failed to arrive. Illness was a constant presence. There were no inoculations, no medical treatments beyond homemade poultices or prayers. Fevers were met with wet cloths. Coughs were treated with boiled pine bark or onion broth. When children began to waste away, losing weight, growing pale, falling into stupors, there was little Clara or anyone could do. No help came. There were no doctors within a day's ride, and even if there had been, few would have made the journey for orphans. The home became a breeding ground for infection, a closed loop of suffering that spiraled with each new arrival or outbreak. Overcrowding only worsened the situation. Word had spread through neighboring settlements that Clara's home would take in any child, and some families, desperate or overwhelmed, began dropping off their children without notice. A boy might be left at the edge of the forest, or a girl tied with a note around her neck. Clara never turned them away, but with each new arrival, the balance tipped further toward collapse. Supplies dwindled faster. Food stretched thinner. The older children grew exhausted, and the younger ones became more unruly. Fights broke out, over blankets, over pieces of fruit, over attention. Beyond the physical hardship, the emotional toll was immense. Many of the children had witnessed the deaths of their parents, their siblings, or even entire communities. Some had been born into hardship and had never known comfort or affection. Crying was common but rarely comforted. Clara was not known for warmth. She believed in discipline, in strength through hardship, and she held fast to the belief that suffering brought one closer to God. For many children, this meant growing up in an environment where affection was absent and rules were enforced with severity. The atmosphere inside the home shifted season by season. In spring, there was hope, planting, new arrivals, warmer weather. In summer, heat and hunger became daily struggles. By autumn, preparation for winter took precedence, but dread lingered in every task. Winter was always the worst. Children died more often during those months. The cold seeped into their bones. Frostbite took toes, sometimes fingers. Bodies grew stiff in the night and were discovered cold in the morning. Death was expected. Mourning, however, was brief. The home could not stop. Chores continued. Life continued. The building itself seemed to reflect the toll. Roof tiles went unrepaired. The door sagged. Shutters hung askew. Inside, the wooden floors were warped with moisture and stained from years of use. Nothing was new. Everything was repurposed, worn down, tired. Just like the children who lived within. No visitor ever stayed long, not because of fear, but because there was simply nowhere to sit, nowhere to breathe. The childcare home had become its own kind of machine, grinding through seasons, through bodies, through names that would never be remembered beyond its crumbling walls. The summer of 1812 began like many others in the Illinois frontier, unpredictable, humid, and heavy with insects. The days grew long and blistering, with little relief from the sun except for the occasional gust of wind through the trees or the brief cloudburst that dried up before it reached the ground. For the children in Clara Bembridge's home, summer meant thinner meals and longer days of labor. It also meant disease, though they didn't yet know it. By the end of that summer, 45 children were dead. It began slowly. A cough here. A fever there. One boy, only 5 years old, stopped eating. He curled up in the corner of the sleeping loft and stared into the wall, unresponsive. Clara thought it was grief, maybe exhaustion. She assigned 2 of the older girls to spoon broth into his mouth, but by the 3rd day he was gone. His body was buried behind the home, beneath a patch of thistle and dry earth, wrapped in a torn linen sheet. Then 2 more children fell ill, both girls, sisters, recently dropped off by a trader who claimed their mother had died en route to Missouri. They began to vomit, then developed deep red rashes along their backs and necks. The other children kept their distance at first, but isolation was nearly impossible in such cramped quarters. Within days, 5 more children were coughing through the night, and 3 had collapsed during morning chores. Clara did what she could, cool compresses, herbal stews, silent prayers, but whatever was moving through the house did not respond to effort or faith. By mid-July, the children began to die almost daily. Sometimes alone in the night, sometimes in each other's arms. Some with visible symptoms, blisters, rashes, spasms, and others who simply stopped breathing after days of listlessness. Clara kept a small ledger of names and dates, scrawled in pencil on a water-stained page. Many entries ended with a question mark, the names guessed or remembered by a sibling, or not at all. Some children had no name when they arrived. The smell in the home shifted. Even the children noticed it. A mix of sweat, rot, and something else, flesh decaying in the heat. Clara tried to keep up with the burials, but the ground was dry and hard. Graves were shallow, some dug by the older boys, others by Clara herself late at night. There was no time for proper ceremonies. No crosses. Others spoke of Clara's strictness, suggesting that her severity had turned divine wrath against her. But no one offered help. No doctor rode in. No supplies were donated. The isolation of the childcare home, once accepted as a quiet act of service, became a wall behind which horror unfolded without interruption. By late August, only a handful of children remained. Gaunt, feverish, silent. Clara herself had stopped speaking for days at a time. She moved through the home like a ghost, tending to the sick, brushing the hair of the dead, digging when she could. Her hands were blistered, her dress torn, her eyes sunken. The structure of the house, already decaying, seemed to mimic the disintegration of its inhabitants. The roof sagged. Floorboards split. The garden went untended, the plants withering beneath the heat. In total, 45 children died between June and the first days of September. The number is repeated in scattered accounts, letters, journals, oral histories, each telling the same story with slightly different names, slightly different details. None explain what the illness was. Some believe it was typhoid. Others suspect dysentery, or an early form of scarlet fever. But no diagnosis was ever made. There were no surviving doctors, no autopsies, no medical records. Only a grave field, and a house that would never be the same. For decades, the story remained a footnote, spoken of rarely, if at all. The mass death of so many children during a single season was too horrific, too unnatural. It was easier to forget. Easier to chalk up to the hardships of frontier life, to the cruelty of nature, to the mystery of God's will. The childcare home stood long after the children were gone, weathered by rain and silence, holding in its bones the heat of that summer and the cries of those who would never grow up. In the years following the summer of 1812, the story of the childcare home that lost 45 children began to fade, not because people forgot, but because few ever fully knew what had happened. The isolation of the location, coupled with the lack of official oversight, meant that much of what occurred during those months was documented only in fragments. There were no formal investigations, no published reports, and no inquiries from authorities. Instead, what remained were pieces, a torn ledger, a settler's diary, the fading memory of survivors, and conflicting local accounts. Over time, these fragments formed a puzzle no one seemed eager to solve. The first record to emerge after the tragedy was a single diary entry written by a man named Elias Fent, a trapper who passed through the settlement in the fall of 1812. In his entry, he described a house of children where death lived that season and claimed to have seen graves dug shallow, with no names. Fent wrote of a woman, presumably Clara, standing barefoot outside, her face streaked with ash, her mouth moving in prayer. He stayed for only one night and left before dawn. His account, discovered nearly a century later in a private family collection, is one of the few first-hand descriptions of the home during or immediately after the event. Despite the loss of life, no census records from that time mention the childcare home or its residents. Children without families were rarely listed individually. Some may have been recorded under the names of whoever last claimed them, but for those left on Clara's doorstep or brought by travelers, there was often no documentation at all. The names of many of the dead were never written down, and those that have been lost to time, ink faded, paper burned, or discarded. Even the existence of Clara Bembridge became a matter of debate among later generations. Some believed she had been invented, a symbol of guilt or grief. Others maintained she had moved away, or died not long after the children. The lack of official recognition may have been intentional. Settlers in nearby communities had no desire to draw attention to the incident, fearing it would reflect poorly on their ability to care for their own or attract unwanted scrutiny from the slowly forming state government. Admitting that dozens of children had perished under one roof, under one woman's watch, might have triggered questions of responsibility, even criminal neglect. Instead, the community let the house stand as a relic and let time do what it does best, erode memory. Among those who survived the summer of 1812 were possibly 3 children. Their identities remain uncertain, as no consistent names appear across sources, but stories passed through families suggest at least 2 girls and 1 boy lived to see another season. One girl reportedly ended up in Missouri, adopted by a traveling preacher's family. Another may have been taken in by a French fur trader passing through the territory. The boy, perhaps the oldest of the group, was said to have fled entirely, disappearing into the frontier. None of these stories can be confirmed with absolute certainty, and none of the supposed survivors left behind written records. By the time Illinois achieved statehood in 1818, the tragedy had already taken on the quality of a local ghost story. Children were warned not to wander into the woods where the house once stood. Some settlers claimed they could hear weeping at night or see small figures in the trees. A few believed the home had been cursed, that the land itself rejected the weight of so many young souls. But the whispers never reached far. No one published an article. No clergyman preached about it. It was an event felt deeply but spoken of in fragments, always in hushed tones. Decades later, during a land survey in the 1840s, a team of government workers noted a patch of soft, uneven earth behind an abandoned log structure near a dry creek bed. One man recorded in his notebook that the area seemed to contain dozens of small, collapsed graves. No further investigation was conducted. The structure, long rotted by then, was torn down to make way for farmland. Its logs repurposed. The graves, unmarked and mostly forgotten, were plowed under and left to sink into the soil. Later generations of settlers built over the land, unaware or willfully ignorant of what lay beneath. A school was erected a few miles away. Then homes. Then roads. The past, buried both literally and figuratively, became part of the foundation of a new American story, one that prized growth and prosperity over the unresolved pain of the frontier. Those who still remembered what had happened in the summer of 1812 rarely spoke of it openly. They passed it on in half-formed stories, in warnings, in glances toward the tree line where nothing now grows quite right. In the years that followed the tragedy, the land where the childcare home once stood took on an eerie silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed to press down against the ears, not from the absence of sound, but from the weight of something unspoken. The trees there grew crooked, leaning at odd angles as if recoiling from the soil. Birds rarely nested nearby. Animals avoided it. Even settlers who passed through instinctively gave it a wide berth, often without realizing why. Something about the ground felt wrong. People described it as heavy, unnatural, even cursed, though few could articulate what that meant. Farmers who tried to till the land reported tools breaking without reason. Crops planted in that patch of earth withered faster than those planted just yards away. One farmer, who bought the property in 1861 for next to nothing, abandoned it within the year. He claimed the soil was dead, the wind carried voices, and his children refused to go near the back pasture. His neighbors didn't question him. They'd heard similar things before. Some had even witnessed strange happenings themselves: plow horses freezing in place, dogs whining and scratching at doors during certain nights, lanterns blowing out without wind. As time passed, the childcare home evolved from a buried truth into a buried myth. Locals began calling the area Widow's Hollow, though no one remembered why. Stories were told around hearths during winter, of a woman who had fed children poisoned soup, or a nursemaid who kept children locked in the cellar and vanished when a storm rolled through. The number 45 was rarely used. Instead, the children became shadows, flickers of movement in the tall grass, laughter caught in the wind, faces glimpsed in the dark between trees. Few knew the story's origin, and fewer still knew it had once been true. In 1894, a schoolteacher named Marian Elcott began collecting oral histories from the elders of nearby homesteads. She was interested in the settlement era and had a particular fascination with frontier hardships. One evening, during a visit to an aging widow named Ruth Winsley, Marian heard the phrase, "the summer the children melted." Ruth, by then nearly 90, said her grandmother had spoken of it, of a home where too many children lived, and a sickness that swept through like fire. Ruth recited details Marian had never heard before: the shallow graves, the girl with blistered hands, the boy who sang to the dead. Marian noted every word and later tried to locate the site, but the land had been sold, renamed, and divided into several parcels. No one living claimed to remember the home. Marian's notes, tucked away in a private collection at a small Illinois college, were forgotten until nearly a century later. In the 1980s, a local historian reviewing the collection stumbled upon the phrase, "the children melted," and traced it back to Marian's notebook. He found references to the 45 deaths and began searching county records, church logs, and family Bibles. He pieced together just enough to confirm that, indeed, something had happened on that land in 1812, something terrible. But with so few surviving documents, his findings were dismissed as speculation. Local officials refused to allow excavation of the suspected burial ground, citing property rights and concerns about disturbing potentially sacred ground. Still, the story resurfaced. People began to talk again, cautiously, quietly. A few families admitted they'd known of the legend, had passed it down for generations. One man recalled his grandfather warning him never to sleep near the stream that ran behind the old pasture, where the earth felt soft year-round, even in drought. A retired postmaster said his mother had forbidden him from speaking the names of the dead aloud, claiming it kept their spirits from latching on. These fragments, though lacking official proof, carried a weight deeper than evidence. They hinted at a truth buried so long it had almost turned to folklore. What remains today are impressions, stories carved into the edges of memory, impressions left in soil and dreams. No marker stands on the land. No plaque acknowledges the children. But the ground remembers. Visitors, even those unaware of the history, report a sense of unease when they walk through the area. Some say the air is colder there, or that they feel watched. A few claim to have seen small handprints on their car windows after parking near the tree line, despite no children being present. Others wake from dreams of fire and ash, though they've never heard the name Clara Bembridge or read a single word of what happened that summer. The memory of the childcare home, though mostly unwritten, seems unwilling to disappear completely. It lives in whispers passed through bloodlines, in stories told half in jest but never truly laughed at. It lives in that patch of Illinois dirt where nothing seems to grow straight, and where silence settles just a little too quickly. The land does not scream, but it does not forget. History, as it's often written, favors the visible, the victories, the monuments, the names etched into stone. But there is a different kind of history, one that lingers beneath our feet, pressed into the soil by footsteps too small to be remembered, erased by time, poverty, and fear. The tragedy of the 1812 Illinois childcare home belongs to this hidden history, the kind buried in silence and passed down only in fragments. What happened to those 45 children was not only a result of illness or circumstance, it was a product of a society that looked away, that valued expansion over protection, and order over empathy. In 1812, America was still at war, not just with foreign powers but with its own geography. Settlers pushed ever westward, carving out plots of land in territories not yet fully claimed, building communities with haste and desperation. Amid this constant movement, children without families were often treated as logistical burdens. They were passed along from cabin to cabin, claimed or abandoned depending on the availability of food or space. Clara Bembridge's home, while framed as charitable, was likely the only place available for dozens of children who had nowhere else to go. Her intentions, whether saintly, stern, or self-preserving, were shaped by a culture that offered her no support. There were no regulatory systems in place to oversee the welfare of children. No formal networks of accountability. No laws requiring the recording of their names or the acknowledgement of their deaths. In this vacuum of structure, children vanished quietly. Their absence didn't disturb census data. Their suffering didn't spark outrage. This absence of record wasn't accidental, it was systemic. Poor, orphaned, and displaced children existed in a legal and moral gray zone, where survival was a privilege, not a right. What happened in that house was not an isolated horror, but a reflection of a broader truth about the disposability of the vulnerable. The tragedy is compounded by the silence that followed. Once the last grave was covered and the house abandoned, the community around it allowed the memory to sink into the earth alongside the bodies. Whether out of shame, fear, or exhaustion, no one spoke publicly of what had happened. No preacher gave a sermon. No public notice was posted. Grief was internalized, twisted into cautionary tales or dismissed as frontier misfortune. The children became whispers, their deaths folded into myth. Even Clara's name, once uttered in reverence or condemnation, faded into an uncertain legend. This collective silence is one of the most haunting parts of the story. It speaks not only to the horror of what happened, but to the way in which societies decide which stories are worth remembering. The children who died had no wealth, no legacy, no families powerful enough to demand justice. They were, to the record keepers of history, unremarkable. Their disappearance didn't disrupt commerce. It didn't halt migration. It didn't even earn a footnote in the formation of a state. And so the silence held, decade after decade, until only the land itself remembered. But silence, like decay, has a texture. Over time, it begins to show its seams. People begin to wonder why a stretch of land remains undeveloped. Why neighbors refuse to walk certain paths. Why children wake from dreams of fire and cold hands. These moments of discomfort are often dismissed, yet they point to something deeply unresolved. The tragedy may not have been documented, but its echoes endure, in fear, in instinct, in the refusal to speak certain names after dark. The tragedy of 1812 is not simply a story of disease or neglect. It is a story about what happens when people are forgotten while they are still alive. When the systems that should have protected them do not exist. When communities choose erasure over accountability. When loss becomes so normalized that it no longer registers as loss. These are patterns that extend far beyond a single home in Illinois. They are visible in every unmarked grave, every undocumented death, every story lost because it didn't serve a narrative of pride or progress. To confront this history is to confront a truth about America's foundation, that even in its earliest days, there were those whose suffering was deemed too inconvenient to remember. The children in Clara's home didn't die simply because of infection or isolation. They died because the world around them allowed it to happen and then refused to carry the weight of it. The silence that followed was not a healing silence. It was a burial, one that layered over pain with indifference and called it moving on. In understanding this tragedy, we are forced to ask difficult questions. Not only about what happened in that long, hot summer, but about how many other stories like it remain hidden beneath the surface of the American landscape. How many homes once echoed with the voices of children who would never grow up? How many graves remain unmarked? How much of our national memory is curated not by truth, but by convenience? The legacy of that forgotten home is not just about the children who were lost, it is about the country that lost them, and the silence it chose to keep. 5.